Welcome to the Explainer. You see the word sanctions in the headlines all the time, right? It's a type of weapon, but what is it really? Today, we're going to break down the logic, the different tools in the toolbox, and ask that billion-dollar question. Does this whole high-stakes game of economic warfare actually work?
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, let's kick things off with a little test. Since World War II, there's one country that's been under U.S. sanctions pretty much nonstop, longer than anyone else. Any guesses who that might be?
All right, pencils down. The answer is Cuba. Yep. For more than 60 years, it's been on the receiving end of a really intense economic embargo. And its story is honestly the perfect place to start. It kind of teaches us the basic rules of the sanctions game. You know, how they're supposed to work.
So we're starting with Cuba, because in a way, it's the original playbook. This is where we get to see the fundamental tools of the trade, the ones that really set the stage for all the other examples we're going to look at today.
I mean, the whole story is a total Cold War classic. It all kicks off with Castro's revolution back in '59. Then things get really tense, escalating to the brink of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's the moment that triggers this massive, full-scale U.S. trade blockade. For decades, though, Cuba managed to hang on, mostly because it had a big, powerful friend, the Soviet Union. But then, the '90s happened, and suddenly, that friend was gone.
So the U.S. brought out two classic and really powerful tools against Cuba. The first one is a trade blockade, and this thing is a real double whammy. It basically says, first, I'm not going to buy any of your stuff, so you can't make any money, and second, I'm not going to sell you any of my stuff, which is going to cause all kinds of shortages. Then there's the asset freeze. This means any money or property the Cuban government has in the U.S. is just frozen, locked down. They can't touch it.
And this chart right here, this basically reveals Cuba's secret to survival. And that secret is having a powerful friend. You see, for decades, the Soviet Union basically propped up Cuba's entire economy, buying all its sugar. But then just look what happens when the USSR collapses. Cuba's GDP just tanks. It drops by a third. Then after 2000, you see it start to creep back up. And why is that? Well, they found a new ally. This time, Venezuela stepped in.
So the big lesson from Cuba is that having an ally can be an absolute lifeline. But what happens when the sanctions aren't just this big blunt blockade? What if they're more like a surgical strike, aimed right at a country's weak spot? Well, if we compare Venezuela and North Korea, we can see exactly why the same basic strategy can have two wildly different results. Okay, so here's the absolute core difference between the two. Venezuela, it was super integrated into the global economy, but it had this one single massive vulnerability: its oil. If you target that, the whole system just crumbles. But North Korea, it was already a fortress. It's kind of hard to isolate a country that's already locked its own doors from the inside, you know? And the impact on Venezuela was just staggering. The U.S. used these really precise financial sanctions to cut the state-owned oil company completely off from the global banking system. That just choked the government's cash flow. And the result? By 2019, hyperinflation hit, wait for it, 300,000%. The economy was just completely and utterly shattered.
Okay, now let's flip over to North Korea. With all these intense global sanctions aimed at stopping its nuclear program, you have to wonder, how do they make any money? So, let me ask you a question. What do you think was their #1 export last year? And I'm talking about something that made up a whopping 40% of their total exports.
The answer, you're not going to believe this, is wigs. I'm serious. Human hair, false eyelashes, even fake beards. See, to get around sanctions, North Korea has become a master of these really niche, hard-to-track industries. They'll import raw hair, process it in their factories, and then ship the finished products out, usually through China. It's bizarre for sure, but it's a surprisingly effective workaround. Okay, so we've looked at basic blockades and these targeted financial strikes. But what if you want to really crank up the pressure? Well, that brings us to Iran. And the case of Iran introduces us to a much more powerful and way more controversial tool. This, my friends, is where the sanctions game truly levels up. This new tool is called a secondary sanction. And honestly, it is a total game changer. What it means is that the U.S. doesn't just sanction the main target, so Iran in this case, it also threatens to punish anyone else. We're talking any country, any company, anywhere in the world that dares to do business with Iran. It's like a massive force multiplier for sanctions.
The easiest way to think about it is like a school playground, right? A normal sanction is simple. The U.S. just tells Iran, hey, I'm not playing with you anymore. But a secondary sanction, that's when the U.S. turns to everyone else on the playground and says, listen up. If you play with Iran, then I'm not going to play with you either. And since the US is, the biggest kid on the playground, pretty much everyone backs away. And just like that, Iran is left standing all alone.
And all of this brings us to our final case study. And this one is like the final boss of sanctions. After the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russia found itself facing a campaign where basically every single tool we've talked about so far was deployed all at once, and on a scale that nobody had ever seen before.
I mean, the response was a total, full-spectrum assault. You had personal sanctions targeting the yachts and the mansions of all the oligarchs. You had huge financial sanctions, like kicking Russian banks out of SWIFT. That's the system banks use to talk to each other globally. A staggering 300 times billion dollars of the country's central bank reserves were frozen solid. Then you had trade sanctions, like capping the price of Russian oil. And on top of all that, hundreds of Western companies just self-sanctioned, packed their bags, and left.
One of the most fascinating side effects of all those companies leaving was the birth of this knockoff economy. Think about it. When all the big Western brands packed up and left, the stores, the buildings, the supply chains, they were all still there. So local entrepreneurs just swooped in, changed the name a little bit, and kept the whole thing running. So Starbucks became Star's Coffee, Zara turned into Mog, and Coca-Cola, it was replaced by something called Dobry Cola.
All right, let's take a step back and look at the big picture here. After running through all these examples from Cuba all the way to Russia, what have we actually learned? Well, it turns out there's this really fundamental paradox, right at the heart of how sanctions either work or, more often, how they don't.
And this brings us to a concept called sanction fatigue. Here's the idea. Sanctions hit the absolute hardest right at the very beginning. They deliver this powerful initial shock to the system. But over time, the target country adapts. It finds new friends, it builds new ways to get paid, and it comes up with clever little workarounds, like North Korea's wig business. So the longer the sanctions stay in place, the less bite they actually have.
And this leads us to maybe the harshest paradox of all. The theory behind sanctions is that if you inflict enough economic pain, the people will rise up and overthrow their leaders. But the reality? It's often the complete opposite. As this quote points out, sanctions can actually make everyday people blame the country imposing the sanctions, not their own government. It creates this rally around the flag effect. And meanwhile, the regime uses the whole crisis as an excuse to clamp down even harder and become more authoritarian.
So where does that leave us? Well, with this ultimate nagging question. The stated goal of sanctions is always to change a government's politics. But the primary result, so often, is just punishing its people. So are they a tool for precise surgical political change? Or are they just a blunt instrument of economic warfare? That, right there, is the real dilemma at the very heart of the sanctions game.